Just to confirm, do we have the live stream up, or are we ready to continue? Okay. And could you tell me where you lost me? Okay, well, look, guys, let's simplify this. Let's make this a little more casual, and hopefully we can regain a little bit more time from the university here, since I know you guys waited a long time for this tonight. And just make it a little bit more casual, because again, nobody likes speeches, right? We're facing a big problem today, right? We have powerful political forces that are asking for more and more power, more and more authority. They say we're facing a time of extraordinary threat. There are now lone individuals, these kind of super criminals, right, like terrorists, spies, and things like that, who are totally capable of destabilizing our entire societies, ending our governments, collapsing our states. Now, there's no real evidence that that's actually the case, but the politics of this fear have really reshaped the way that our laws are being passed. So we have to figure out how do we maintain a free society in the context of an unlimited government. This we've seen in Canada through bills such as C-51 and so on and so forth. The United States, of course, we had the birth of mass surveillance on a truly global scale. The UK is now passing what they call the Investigatory Powers Bill, which is really an unrestrained, unprecedented intrusion into the private lives of every citizen, not only in their country, but everywhere else. When the government is presuming a trust in the propriety of their actions that no longer exists. This story about the Montreal police spying on a journalist through their phone in a very intense way for the particular reason, a specified reason, of uncovering the sources behind their journalism is a radical attack on the operations of the free press. And speaking as one of the directors of the Freedom of the Press Foundation, this unsettles me not only on a personal level, but I think is something that actually represents a threat to the traditional model of our democracy. Can we recognize, or at least debate in a reasoned way, a new idea which is somewhat radical, which is that law is beginning to fail as a guarantor of our rights? It is the lowest bar protecting the way we operate, interact with one another, because government has built in so many mechanisms to get around these things, these restrictions, when it wants to, that now the local police can decide that they don't like a journalist's reporting. They can go to a justice of the peace, and the justice of the peace will quite happily say, okay, that sounds great. Look at the GPS on his phone. Figure out everywhere he's traveling. Figure out everyone he's communicating with. No, you can't actually read his emails. No, you can't actually listen to his calls. But you can find out everyone he met with, who he called, how long he was on the call with, and from this derive an extraordinary understanding of how this individual works. And it wasn't just one. It's now expanding. We're hearing 6, maybe possibly more. And rather than the police chief saying, all right, this was clearly something that went too far, and regardless of whether or not I authorized this operation, I recognize that to restore trust, I need to reestablish the basis of accountability. That accountability that is lost when our operations become secret. And for that reason, I have chosen to resign. We don't see the mayor calling for that. We don't see the local premier calling for that. And it's this question, this dynamic, where our governments are increasingly invested with extraordinary capabilities to peer into all of our private lives with very little interference. Whereas we, the public, can know almost nothing about how they operate. This inverts the traditional dynamic of private citizens and public officials. into this brave new world we're facing of private officials and public citizens.
Thank you so much for that. And actually, I think this is really great because over the last couple of weeks, I was able to get a lot of really amazing questions. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to ask one or two questions, and then we'll also take questions from the audience. So I'm going to start with a question from Vincent Prager, who's a member of Media at McGill Board of Trustees. And he's quite interested in ethics in journalism. And so this is how the question is oriented. Given your status of a fugitive in the eyes of the United States government, what ethical considerations and or restrictions should guide the media in the United States and elsewhere around the world in reporting on you and your story? Are there different ethical guidelines from country to country? What is your level of satisfaction with such reporting on your story? And has it been equally fair from country to country? So it's a nice kind of comparative media question. So take it away.
So one of the things that I've tried to be very careful about since June of 2013 when I first came forward was not telling the media how to do their job. I worked very hard to make sure that I wasn't in the decision, that I didn't say what was published or not. In fact, this is something that not everyone understands, but the number of documents that I published, that I made publicly available, has been zero. Instead, I gathered inside the NSA what I believe to be evidence of criminal activity within the government. And this wasn't just in the United States government, this was the Five Eyes surveillance alliance, right? This is a transnational spying group consisting of the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. And this is, of course, why we have some understanding now of what was actually going on behind the curtain in Canada about the operations of their sort of surveillance context. And that is, excuse me while I try to find the reference for this here, something that has actually been established in the wake of 2013 with more scrutiny, that Canada actually has the weakest intelligence oversight out of any major Western country. This was something that people didn't really expect. Now, they're not the most aggressive of all countries. They don't have the largest scale. But no one's really watching. There is no real parliamentary understanding of what's happening behind the door. And this is what allowed them to engage in massive, sort of indiscriminate surveillance. Dragnet surveillance that was affecting millions of Canadians, that was targeting, for example, the app stores that you might connect to with your phones, things that have now been published and we can now debate, but prior to these disclosures, we didn't really know, right? But here's the idea behind this comparative media question. This was my belief, that these things were violations of human rights, of written statutory laws, or our basic constitutional principles. But what if I was wrong? What if I was sort of this crazy radical, and I had been in my head so long, working in these intelligence places, talking to my coworkers, that I just didn't have a full understanding. Maybe I didn't see the big picture. If I published these things on my own, I believe there was a somewhat larger risk, a greater risk, that I would go too far. And so because of this, I chose instead to replicate the system of checks and balances in our government that had unfortunately failed over time, to try to restore that balance. And the way that I wanted to check myself was to instead provide this archive of documents to journalists, who would then be required, by virtue of gaining access to this archive, to make an independent judgment in every case for every story. Not that it was newsy, not that it was interesting, not that it was just a sexy story, but it was actually in the public interest to know about the details of this operation, of that operation, why it mattered, what was going on, how it was being accomplished, and what this meant for our rights. Now, beyond this, as an additional safeguard to mitigate risks, I wanted these journalists to then go to the governments who are actually carrying out these operations in each case to allow the government a chance to argue that they didn't understand these stories, that maybe they had gotten the calculus wrong. Maybe there was some detail, some sentence in the story that would actually put a human life at risk just because it was like something that a journalist might not recognize, like the employee number of somebody that's a cafeteria worker overseas, but might actually be an intelligence source who could be recognized by these documents. And in every case, this was followed, right? The government didn't get a veto. They couldn't say you can't publish these stories. But they could say, look, this is dangerous or it's not. And this is why in 2016, I believe, the government has never been able to show a single case, credible or incredible, of any evidence that indicates anybody came to harm as a result of this reporting. Now, there's a second dynamic of this question, which is screw the NSA, screw the reporting, screw all the actual stuff that's going on about these surveillance operations, and what's going on with me? Are people being fair to me, and are they covered this way or that way? Are some countries doing better, some countries doing worse? And of course, this is the case. We have seen in the majority of countries that are not the United States, they've done public polling opinion, and pretty much universally, people have a positive opinion of what I did. The United States government, of course, has been running a very active smear campaign to reduce the level of support for my arguments and for this journalism ever since 2013. And it has been to some extent effective, not fully actually. There's a surprising amount of support. The three largest human rights groups in the world, the ACLU and the three leading groups, the American Civil Liberties Union, Amnesty International, and Human Rights Watch, are now actually petitioning the President of the United States to drop what the media calls his war on whistleblowers. But here's the central idea there, from my perspective. It doesn't actually matter what people say about me. I am the least important part of this story. And if you're thinking about sort of me, what's happening to me, what my futures look like, you're missing the larger question, which is what happens to all of us.
Well, thank you for that very thoughtful question. What I'm going to do now is ask one more question, and then already people are lining up, or they're just sitting on the stairs. So line up if you have some questions. All right, so I'm really actually excited about this question. It's by one of my students, Aaron Gluck-Thayer, who, like Snowden, is very much passionate about these issues. He's an engineering student here at McGill. And I'm just going to read it because he wrote it very carefully. He says, it's clear that intelligence agencies interpret their legal mandate expansively. Michael Hayden, the former director of the NSA, famously said, quote, give me the box you will allow me to operate in. I'm going to play to the very edges of that box. I will play very aggressively in it. Canada's Foreign Intelligence Agency, CSE, is similar. By exploiting the uncertainty in the legal definition of metadata, it can, quote, incidentally collect troves of personal data on Canadians. Canadian Domestic Intelligence Agency, CSIS, also operates under a similar culture. And he gives another example and then goes on to say, under Bill C-51, CSIS's expansive capabilities were broadened even further. The only limits to their new and vague disruption powers are that CSIS cannot willfully obstruct justice, cause bodily harm, or violate sexual integrity. I promise this is the only very detailed question like this. So there seems to be a culture in intelligence agencies of working the law to their purposes and pushing the law to its boundaries. Intelligence agencies don't ask what their surveillance practices should be, Rather, they ask what their surveillance practices are allowed to be. And then he says, this can create the appearance of lawfulness, which the government points to whenever the activities of intelligence agencies are challenged by the public, but all it does is subvert the law. So here's the question. How do we ensure that intelligence agencies interpret the law not just narrowly, but in a way that is reconcilable with what the public reasonably expects? When reforming our intelligence agencies, do we have to abandon the premise that intelligence agencies are committed to following the law in a reasonable way?
So this is a great question. It's a very complex question. One of the interesting things is the question quoted Michael Hayden, former director of both the NSA and the CIA, which is a little bit of a mistake because, of course, if you're the head of the CIA and the NSA, you are literally a professional liar. Deception is sort of your business. So he has a little bit of a checkered history because he says, give me the lines of the box and I'll play to the edge. I'll get chalk on my cleats, but I won't leave the field to play. Unfortunately, we have documentary proof that that's not the case. He was actually asked, as director of the NSA in the post-9/11 period, by the President of the United States through the Vice President's lawyer, would he basically violate the law? There was a controversy where the Attorney General of the United States said that the NSA's operations were unlawful. They could not be performed consistently with the authorities that were provided under the Constitution or statutes that they passed authorizing their operations. And the President came to him through these proxies and said, would you go ahead and continue spying on everyone anyway, even if the Attorney General is against it? And he said yes. And this is not to beat up him specifically because he's not so important. He's just one of a long line of officials that do the same thing. As you mentioned, it happens across borders, it happens across cultures, it happens across languages. You're kidding yourself if you think intelligence officials in France, Germany, China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, Brazil, India aren't doing the same thing. This is how they operate. So this means the central premise of that question, how do we trust and ensure that we can trust these intelligence agencies and officials to interpret the law fairly, to operate fairly? And the answer is you can't. But what you can do is put processes and instructions in place where you don't have to. And this leads us to kind of the failings of C-51 and the larger problem of Canada's intelligence apparatus, where there is no oversight that's meaningful. There are three main problems, fundamental problems with C-51, which the current Prime Minister of Canada, correct me if I'm wrong, did campaign to reform, and unfortunately has not done so. Most experts who have studied this bill say it actually can't be reformed in a meaningful way. As written, it should be repealed entirely, and then a better measure passed from scratch that loses all the baggage. But first off, there's no meaningful oversight there, right? What would be meaningful oversight? How do you ensure that you don't have to trust these intelligence officers? And the way you do that is you appoint a judicial body, some mechanism, some structure, some commission that has independent prosecutorial authority that is mandated to perform a case-by-case review of these intelligence agencies, these police agencies, their use of powers, exceptional powers, after the fact of investigation to ensure that no illegalities occurred. And if they did occur, they can then prosecute on those cases. The only thing that will ensure that these intelligence agencies or police agencies or even corporations, if they gain access to these kind of mass surveillance capabilities, play fairly, is the threat of criminal sanction. Now, this means basically you don't give in the way of the intelligence services saying, look, you've got to go, do all of these things before you investigate this person or that person, before you pull email of someone that you suspect is a terrorist. But you must know that in every case, we're going to have a judge and a prosecutor going through your decisions after the fact And if you did break the law, you will be held to the account of our laws in that case. The second thing is sharing without necessity, transparency, or accountability right. Canada's services can now make available all of the different information that they hold about you. And this can be things such as your health records, right? It doesn't have to actually be anything spooky. They can now be traded amongst agencies, even if you're not related to some real terroristic threat or anything like that. It's not very well limited. And then there's this larger question of the criminalization of speech, right? We already see that spying authorizations, legal authorizations, that weren't intended to be used for spying in this context or for surveilling people who are not terrorists, or real criminal threats, violent threats, threats to life, and so on and so forth, are instead being used, repurposed for monitoring terrorists and things like, or monitoring terrorists, forgive me, monitoring journalists who are not the same as terrorists, despite what the GCHQ says. Unless you work at an intelligence agency, in case you might be worried about that. But the idea here is, let's take that example of the Canadian journalists who've been spied on by the Montreal police. We have the news story saying that what happened, but we still don't actually know under what legal authority it occurred. There is a suspicion that this was actually done under Bill C-13, correct me if I'm wrong, fact check me audience, that was actually intended to be passed as a cyberbullying law. That's how it was branded. Was that actually being used to collect communication of journalists? Was C-51 involved or any of these other legal authorities involved? We don't know, because we have no idea what the government is actually doing underneath that curtain. And that is not just a risk, that is a fundamental danger to the stability of any open and liberal society. Suddenly, we have a set of rules for all of you in the audience. There's a set of rules that can get whistleblowers and journalists charged and investigated by police. But what about when police break the law? What about when spies break the law? Suddenly, they're being held to a very different legal standard, and they're entitled to a veil of secrecy that inoculates them against criticism and scrutiny that the rest of us do not enjoy. That is an imbalance of power that is not only, I would say, unwise, but is actually anti-democratic. It is authoritarian in nature.
So go ahead and try, unlike what I just did, keep the question a bit short so we can get to others.